Hi, everybody. This is Jose Palomino with another episode of the Revenue Throughput Podcast. And our guest today is Roel Hoekstra, CEO and founder of Akela Partners.com. You can find him at akela-partners.com. And Roel's going to talk to us about something that's really exciting, really on the cutting edge, and especially for smaller companies than you might think. And that is AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, as applied to lead generation. It's real, it's doable, and it's available. And we're going to learn all about it. So let's welcome Roel to our show. And welcome Roel to the Revenue Throughput Podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Roel, I was fascinated by just looking at your background, what you do with your firm. Could you tell us a little bit about who you typically work with?
Sure. We typically work with B2B business owners and marketing executives. Generally, they're service oriented, although that's not exclusive. I come out of a service oriented world myself. I was in marketing and management consulting for a long time, so I'm very comfortable with service oriented businesses. But what we do applies to B2C companies just as well as it does really B2B, and you could even do manufacturing. But most of the clients that I work with directly will be B2B companies, service oriented, in the mid-market area, right? So some can be big. I mean, there's not, some of the stuff we do applies equally to Fortune 500 companies, and I tell you, they're not doing it any better than the smaller ones, but most of the people we work with tend to be under $100 million in revenue. So okay. It's,
well, those big companies,
2 to 100 million. Well, the big companies, you think that because they're doing a couple billion in sales, they figured this stuff out, but they really haven't. I don't know.
That's interesting.
They just exist. They've been around for a while. They have brand, right?
Right.
Because they
have scale, right? So they can actually just do more. If they're making mistakes, they can do more of those mistakes bigger. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the big challenges that when you're talking to somebody, you say, "Boy, I think we can help these people." Like, what do those challenges sound like?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we're a marketing firm, right? So the challenge that our prospects and customers come to with is almost exclusively that they need more high quality leads. So no matter how you say that, right? I need better leads, I need more leads. The ability to consistently generate lead flow is the challenge that they have, especially as they try and scale. So I actually do stick scaling into the front of that. So to be able to generate lead flow at scale, it's one thing, obviously, if you're living off of referrals. You have a billboard on 95. These kinds of things can generate some leads. But if you want to sort of get scale and you want to grow, figuring out how to do that is the challenge that I see most often.
Right. So let's say you have a company. I'll draw a straw man for the point of illustration. Somebody in some industrial type service, they're like an engineering firm or something, and $50 million top line. They got 20 account manager type folks working, trying to keep them busy. Right, so they each charted $2 to $3 million in top line contribution each. So in that scenario, let's say they're doing that for a couple of years. It sounds like, hey, it's probably working. It's a $50 million company. Everybody's making some money and so on. So what are some of the things that they're feeling? Kind of, if we're the doctor, what would be the symptoms that we could do better?
Yeah, well, it's actually interesting you use that example because I had a client that pretty much fit that example for a fairly long time. And I think you raise a really interesting question with your straw man, because what you said in your straw man was they're doing okay. Everybody's making money, right? So fundamentally, if everybody's doing okay, then they're not really struggling. So you have to have somebody that doesn't feel like they're doing okay. So when I look at symptoms, it's that they're not doing okay. They're not able to meet their revenue growth, right? So I mean, if you're a $50 million business and you have a 15% revenue growth for the year, well, that's $7.5 million,
Mm-hmm.
right? So where are you going to come up with $7.5 million in new revenue?
It gets harder as you start climbing that
Exactly,
mountain, right?
right. So I mean, if you're a $500,000 business, right, that's $7,500, I think, or
Right,
if I'm
right.
doing the math pretty quickly, 75,000. Anyway, so that's one thing. 7.5 million. Okay, where are you going to get that from? So struggling to grow is really the one thing that we see, and then you can really split that into two ways. You talk about the straw man being an engineering company, and I came from a consulting firm. So similar in that sense. And we always looked at two things. Are you adding enough new names every month, every year? So are you getting new clients in the door to build that revenue stream from? And are you able to grow the revenue from your existing clients? So you have to be able to sort of look at those two things separately. And when you think about growing the revenue from existing clients, I always look at it as how much of the pie do you have, right? I mean, so
Mm-hmm.
if you're doing you got 2 or 3 lines of business, are you doing those 2 or 3 lines of business for your clients? So when you have account executives, right, oftentimes account executives are going to be focused on growing relationships they have. And again, if we're talking there are lots of different companies. Almost all companies, you need recurring revenue, right? So if you're in some sort of a subscription model, that's really easy, relatively speaking. If you're doing project sales, well, then you have to stay in touch with your clients so that you can be there to sell the next project or can help keep that going. So when I look at symptoms, typically it's that you're not adding enough new names each month, so you're not bringing in new clients, because it doesn't matter how good you are, you're going to lose old clients, at some rate, right? They
But let's
merge,
also talk a
they
little
go out
bit.
of business, et cetera.
So, Rule, if we could just hit a little bit, I just want to loop back a little bit to the idea of growing existing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the challenges is if you're selling to a very large company, even a $50 million company, but it's selling to a Fortune 500
Mm-hmm.
company, that AE may have a very good relationship for line of business number one. He's
Mm-hmm.
dealing with he or she is dealing with the vice president, whatever, great relationship, doing $500,000 a year over year. It's all great. So they kind of hit their number, but the reality is moving laterally to another VP level person in another
Mm-hmm.
division. It's a lot like trying to crack the code on brand new business again,
Yes.
because your VP, the VP you're dealing with, may not be that inclined to bend over backward. They may like you enough, but it's not like they're going to say, okay, I'm going to make it my cause to bring you into some other area. So you still got to do the hard work there, right? So do you
You
find that some of these
do.
sales teams don't? They get kind of like they
Oh,
find their
absolutely.
niche and they stay there.
And not only is it the vice president at your client company that you described, I think you'll find a lot of account executives are scared to do that. Why? Because what's the risk of taking on a new line of business with somebody you don't know at that company? Well, maybe you don't do that great a job. It's not a good project. And what does that do? Well, it puts at risk the
Right.
business that's working over here. I was a partner in a large management consulting firm, and my job was to grow sales, right, across our revenue. And I'll tell you, the hardest thing we had was getting the people responsible for doing the individual lines of business to then introduce us in, because they didn't want to put their slice of the pie at risk. So it goes both ways. I do think that when you're trying to grow revenue from existing clients, there are two things, right? I mean, are you able to do more in the service offering that you're doing now, right? So how do I do more of what I do? is question one. And then how do I do something else for that company is number two. And the doing something else for that company isn't all that different than bringing in new names, in the sense that you have a warmer relationship, right? You're a known entity. Certainly if you're selling to big companies, you're already in their accounts payable system, they know who you
Sure.
are. All that kind of stuff makes it easier, but it's still a bit of a new sale, right? Because you're not doing that work
So
now, right?
what's
And you
interesting,
probably have to displace somebody else who might be doing that work.
what's interesting though is, so you need to do that. It's kind of one of these, like, you got to walk, run, and chew gum at the same time. You got to do it
All at the
all.
same time.
So, just personal experience. Years ago, I had an account that we started with a small project, expanded, got into a different country division, got into a different department. It was all like coming up roses, right? It was fantastic. And we had great relationship with the whole senior management team. Then they got acquired.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the entire senior management team bailed, like rats from a sinking ship. And the ship wasn't sinking, it was doing fine. They just did not like the new regime.
Right.
And they were gone literally in less than 6 months. Everybody in my very deep Rolodex inside that organization was gone. And it just happened like that. And it was brutal. And it was like starting from scratch all over again. In fact, even worse, because they were parts of the new regime that said, well, whatever those guys were doing before, we want to start fresh. So I wasn't part of the fresh, the fresh coat of paint. They wanted a fresh coat of paint there. So interesting. You have to do both. You have to get the new accounts, and you have to grow where you are. Now, Roel, you do something interesting,
Yeah.
which caught my attention around the use of AI. And we hear a lot about AI. Our cars have AI. Our toaster oven has AI. Everybody has AI, right? But how does that play into the world of lead generation, demand generation, the things that you help companies with? And how would that help somebody who's listening who says, well, I'm not like IBM. What am I going to do with AI? How do you connect the dots there for folks?
So now we're talking. Now we're cooking with fire here. Or cooking with gasoline. Yeah. So AI is essentially means some kind of machine learning, right? So really what we're doing with AI is trying to do pattern recognition. That's the basic minimal level of artificial intelligence. So I think, and I, you talked about symptoms a little bit, but I almost look at this as sort of the classic mistake that these B2B companies make that we're talking about, the straw man that you did, or any of these, not embracing digital marketing and artificial intelligence because it's there and it works. So if you are doing sales today and you're not adding enough new names, in the old days, and I go back to when I was doing this as a sales rep, what did we do? We would have to sort of say, well, what piece of content, what's something interesting that our target audience would like to know about? And let's do a seminar, right? Because we did seminars, and we would send out a mailing to 1,000 CEOs, and we had something unique in the market. So we got people to come to a seminar, and we made an offer to them that we'd come in and do an audit of some sort and get projects rolling. So that's sort of the old way to do it, right? Well, that's pretty expensive, all things considered. I mean, just think about the amount of time associated with building that list, sending out letters, it's 50 cents a letter too, right? So, getting all that stuff out, getting people to come in, then having to go meet with them, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these were big projects, $500,000 projects. So it's certainly worth doing. Well, today, digital marketing has fundamentally flipped this. And I'm going to talk about Facebook here in particular, because my second mistake that I see B2B businesses making is that they ignore or minimize Facebook. They don't think Facebook is for them. But there's a reason that Facebook is as gigantic as it is. And that is it has three things that you need to use artificial intelligence well. It's got identity resolution. Because you log into Facebook, they know who you are and they know everything you do on their platform. Now, there's some things that are changing with their well, they're third-party platforms, but as long as you're in the Facebook ecosystem, they know everything you're doing. And secondly, they have that big data. So the identity resolution and the big data, right? Knowing what you do, everything that you're doing, and knowing who you are allows them to then figure out if somebody converts, whatever a conversion is, right? A form fill, an appointment, a sale, whatever that conversion is, they can go back at their entire audience, and they have 2.5 billion people on the platform, right? I think that's the number.
Right. Bigger than any nation.
Like, and fundamentally, you know, a thing that kind of cracks me up. People say, well, Facebook is sort of for older people, you know, people like me. You know, the kids are on Instagram. Well, they own Instagram. So first of all, there's no difference between Instagram and Facebook. But I guarantee that your clients, my clients, their prospects are on Facebook because they're older. They're not 20-year-old kids, right? So fundamentally, once Facebook knows what it's looking for, or any artificial intelligence engine, I'm just using Facebook as an example, once they know what they're looking for, who is it converted, they can go back in time and look at all the activities, all the things that that person did that led up to the conversion. And with one person, that's interesting. With 50, they actually have something to work with. And if you can give them a couple hundred to 1,000, well, they can create a really good algorithm so that they're able to just constantly be sifting through all the people on their network. And they say, ooh, look at that guy. That's the person that you want to advertise to, because they are exhibiting the behaviors that your good customers or prospects are exhibiting. And that means you can now be very specific with your advertising. And in the B2B world, which is where I started this, that's hugely important, because in B2B, you're typically selling larger kind of relationship stuff, larger project. You're not doing, you know, $30 sneakers.
It's not transactional, right?
It's not quite as transactional. And therefore, you just don't want to waste too much money advertising to people that don't care, right? That's the whole thing, is you can now be incredibly laser focused. And, you know, I think with B2B, we often think, well, LinkedIn or, you know, advertising in trade journals and things like that. I'm telling you, Facebook is really a phenomenal place to do B2B advertising. You do have to be able to make it work. So it's different than sort of doing B2C advertising. Your message has to be really focused on the the problem that you solve and the solution that you deliver. And you've got to be able to have the targeting. You have to know who you really want to be targeting. And there are various ways to do that. But, you know, fundamentally, artificial intelligence today, which requires, as I said, identity resolution, big data, and the third component is unlimited, lots of computing power. So, and in today's world, we have unlimited computing power, right? So we just do. Our firm, we have our own artificial intelligence solution for companies. So we have our own identity graph, just like Facebook. We are tracking 250 million Americans every day across all things. So it's consumers. And we have our own source of data. We get data from Google, from Facebook, from authority websites. We get 5 billion pieces of behavioral data every day. And where does it go? It all goes onto Amazon servers. And essentially you have unlimited computing power, so that for all kinds of businesses, big businesses, B2B businesses, small businesses, $10 million businesses, we can create that artificial intelligence algorithm directly and say, who should you be advertising to? Who are the people that are actually doing the observable behaviors that indicate they're likely to, you know, be a good customer of yours? Well, Facebook does that just to finish this
Yeah,
one thought,
sure.
Jose, sorry. Facebook does that for you for free, right? But the only way to access it is to pay them to advertise, right? So it's not really free. They're providing the engine, and they don't tell you who the people are, but they will put your message in front of them. Our platform is slightly different because we charge you to do that work, but then it's yours, and you can take that platform and you can advertise to those people any way you want, right? Pick up the phone, call them, you can send a piece of direct mail, you can load them into Google and Facebook and YouTube, any LinkedIn, all these advertising platforms, and seed their engines. And once you start doing that, now you have really primed the pump, so to speak, so that you have control over your first party data, you know exactly who you should be advertising to based on their observable behaviors, and you can reach them wherever they are, right? And then maintain top of mind awareness by continuing to advertise just to that population that's the right population.
So, Rule, one thing that comes to mind as you described it. So, first of all, that's amazing, right? And I love the simplicity, the way you described it. ID resolution, you got to know who the who is. Big data, the ability to handle lots of data, and then unlimited computing power. And I agree with you with the on-demand computing power available today. It's there's no upper limit. It's not like the old days where people are
No,
actually
it's just
concerned about that, right? So,
right. The more clients, the more cash, the more you can, the more you can put through the systems.
right, it's a
So
utility. It's like plugging
I
into
don't
the
have to
electric.
build. I don't have to build a data center, right? I
You
just
mean
rent the
behind that
data.
wall behind you is not a giant data center?
No, there's a beach.
There's a beach. That's great. But here's the one thing, and we won't have time to fully develop it, but I just want to touch on it briefly. So yes, now with AI, as you've described it, and you've done, I think, a really very helpful job of helping us understand the implications of AI here. It's really about making sure you get your message to the right humans at scale, right? You can do this at scale. However, the remaining part is the message, like the actual
Mhm.
messaging, the sequence of messaging, and so on. And we won't have time to fully develop that. But is that something you would help clients with, or is that something that they should have that capability in house to, like, you got to have your act together, you got to know what your messages are, your value
Well,
proposition, all of that.
yeah. I mean, we do. Yes, we do. We do the marketing piece. Helping people figure out campaigns, doing the ad buying. Making all this come to work. We sell the data. We do the marketing component. Um, you can do the marketing component inside. You can use another firm, to do the marketing component. You really can't get the data anyplace else. So our our unique value proposition is the data that we provide. Uh, I think our team's really good for doing the marketing piece, but I recognize there are a couple other people that do marketing in this world, so that's not necessarily
No, but that's great
as
because what
directly
that
unique.
what that does, Rule, it says to somebody listening to this as we come to the end of our time right now, I just want them to really realize that, and I think your core message here is that even these very super advanced ideas like AI lead generation is available and doable for even moderate sized companies. It's not something that only the Fortune 500 can do.
No, it's very doable, and I'll give you one really quick example because it fits in with the straw man a little bit that we dealt with. I have a client today that builds data centers and does other sort of large construction projects around the country. They have two sales reps, right? Blah blah blah. They were generating 5 to 10 leads a month, just the old-fashioned way. And literally within 2 weeks of implementing this, we're pushing through 200 to 300 leads. People who are actively considering buying from them. So it is fundamentally changed how that works. They're a small company. I
Well,
don't
they
know
won't be
exactly
for
how big
long
they
the
are.
way you described them.
Um, well, yeah.
Yeah.
And it just literally it doesn't cost that much. I mean, it's remarkably inexpensive, all things considered. So, the opportunity is really huge for these smaller companies. Big companies can do it, and I'll tell you, they're not doing a very good job either. So I fundamentally think that in the B2B space, we are really at the very beginning of starting to use
Wow.
this technology effectively in the B2B world. So people that are listening to this, you have a head start. I guarantee you that General Electric isn't doing a better job, than the engineering company straw man that you just laid out there in terms of how they do this, because they're all still thinking about it in an older fashioned way. B2C world, they've gotten a little bit ahead of this because it seems to make a little more sense. But in the B2B world, the opportunities are just huge.
Wow.
Um,
So to that end, Rule, just because we are at the end of our
yep.
time here, if somebody wanted to know more about your work, how to work with you, and so on, where should they go?
Well, I would say come check out our website, which is Akela, Akela dash partners.com. I have a fair amount of free resources on there. One thing that I worked on not too long ago and put out there is a free AI training course. So I just
Oh,
recorded it. It's like 8 episodes. And I cover from sort of start to finish how you really want to be thinking about implementing AI for B2B companies specifically.
so
So it's free. You just have to tell me who you are, even though I
okay,
know because we do identity resolution. But
sure.
it's helpful if you tell me, and then you get it. Then you get it for
And
free.
we'll include a link to that specific resource
Okay.
in our show notes
Excellent.
when we're
Thank
done.
you.
So, with that, Rule, thank you. You've been tremendously helpful, I'm sure, to many people listening and very clear. And thanks again for being on the Revenue Throughput podcast.
Thank you, Jose. I appreciate it.